This is the last in a series of presentations we've done on interviews that Astra Taylor did with contemporary philosophers. This one's dedicated to Judith Butler with Sunaura Taylor, and the subject for the interview, or the theme for it, is interdependence. Some of this is stated on the next slide, but I think it helps to see. I mean, this is Judith Butler on the right as we look at it, and Sunaura Taylor on the left. Some of this I've already mentioned in the opening slide, but again, this is the last of a series of interviews that Astra Taylor does in her Examined Life documentary series. The location for this interview is in San Francisco, on the city streets, and the two primary participants are taking a walk. We could put walk in quotation marks because that's one of the first questions that's raised. What does it mean to take a walk if you're in a wheelchair? Just a little bit about the primary figures. Judith Butler is I would say she's kind of the intended focus for this interview, although, you know, what Sunaura Taylor has to say comes through, loud and clear, and it may be even stronger than what Judith Butler has to say. But Judith Butler is an American philosopher who's well known in the contemporary field for her work on gender theories, LGBT issues, contributor to queer theory, and contributes to feminism as well. I think you'd have to say it's what they call third wave feminism. Sunaura Taylor is not as well known, and just for a kind of a connection, I mean, Sunaura Taylor is the sister of Astra Taylor, who's put the whole documentary together. And it seems to me that she's more commonly called Sunny Taylor. And Sunny has a number of things that she's involved with. She's a working artist. She's an animal rights activist and a disability rights activist. And we don't have time in this presentation to give examples, but if you look up Sunaura Taylor's artwork, you'll see that a lot of it is focused on what it means to be disabled, and also a lot of it's focused on the way animals are treated, and so they're pretty strong images. And again, as I said in the opening slide, that the theme here is interdependence. The conversation begins with Judith Butler kind of acting like their interviewer. So she asked Sunny Taylor a number of questions about what her background is and her experience as a disabled person. So she begins by talking about what it means to take a walk, and for instance, if you're confined to a wheelchair, which Sunny obviously is. And Sunny claims that she takes a walk. She uses that terminology, those words, and she says that and other people in the disabled community would also use it as well on a daily basis. So, and it's the two of them, as they exchange, point out that it's like everybody needs something. I mean, even to take a walk. I mean, so it's not so out of the world. I mean, to take a walk in a wheelchair, and you say everyone needs sidewalks or spaces to walk in. You need shoes and and things like that. So this idea that you don't need anything to take a walk is kind of just a partial understanding of what's involved here. This idea of taking a walk is also an aspect of a lot of the interviews that were done by Astra Taylor. I mean, this idea of bringing philosophy out into the streets meant that the interviews would be conducted while people were moving. You see that clearly in some of the segments, not as clearly in others. I mean, the Cornell West one is they're driving in a car. There's the one with Peter Singer is clearly they're out walking around, and the one with Martha Nussbaum, clearly they're out walking around. But it's this idea of being engaged in physical activity is one of the ways in which philosophy comes out into the street. So here they're very definitely taking a walk. Sunny Taylor observes that one of the reasons why she moved to San Francisco was because San Francisco had arranged everything for the benefit, or many things for the benefit of disabled people. Everything was more accessible in this city, and so it was possible for a disabled person to have more access to public spaces because of that kind of work. And this was, in a way, she comments that this improved access that people have to public spaces does a lot towards the acceptance of disabled people, because usually disabled people have a hard time getting out into public, and people don't get used to seeing them so much. So if you live in a place where it's possible for disabled people to get out in public and be there, it makes it easier for people, other people, to get used to their presences. Sunny, so that's a help to have that kind of environment to function in. Sunny, emphasizes though that everything that you want to accomplish as a disabled person has to be struggled for. And so there's a kind of nothing comes easy. She talks about even going into a coffee shop, for instance, can be a big deal if you're a disabled person. No one else would have to think too much about that. She described one instance when early on for herself where she used to have to go to a park across the street from the coffee shop and sit there for like hours sometimes. I mean, to build up the courage to actually go into the coffee shop. So it's kind of to overcome that kind of struggle is a part of what the lived experience of being a disabled person. So there's a lot of struggle just to have a normal existence. So it's difficult enough to even have access to public spaces, but in a city like San Francisco, where there is access, it's a help for disabled people to become more accepted, just because they become part of the environment. People see them more often. Even still, disabled people cause a lot of people to feel uncomfortable because basically they don't know how to deal with them, or they don't know how to interact with them. And in that discomfort, or that not knowing how to relate, I mean, will oftentimes cause people to avoid interactions with disabled people. But that doesn't help the problem at all for a disabled person. In particular, as Sunny relates, since she has limited use of her her hands, and sometimes she'll use her mouth in order to do things that would seem kind of shocking if other people saw it. I think she says she can use her mouth to open doors, for instance, and that people are shocked by seeing body parts used in unusual ways, and people view that as it's abnormal behavior. So that's another factor that disabled people have to deal with. But as Judith and Sonny converse, I mean, the idea that the norm that's violated may well just be an ideal or an assumption that people have, which in reality doesn't actually exist. But there is this, and it's related in a way to this norm of self-sufficiency, this idea that everybody should be able to take care of themselves. But clearly in the case of disabled people, in a lot of instances, they're going to need help for even basic things. So that just creates more of an obstacle. So this raises the question of interdependence, and Butler poses the question pretty succinctly. You say, do we or do we not live in a world where we help one another? And we'll see that that's not, for some people, they're not used to that way of thinking. They don't believe that people should need help, And so this, in a way, I mean, Sunny talks about when she goes into a coffee shop, for instance, she'll have to ask for help in terms of getting the coffee to a table so that she can drink it. And she says, well, she's capable of holding the coffee cup in her mouth and going to the table, but that's actually more disruptive than asking somebody to bring the coffee to the table for her. So, and it seems like, a world where people accept the idea that we're interdependent, that we need to help one another, that wouldn't be a problem. But it's still something that is not obvious to a lot of people. The discussion in general brings back some of the things that Nussbaum was talking about, and some of the criticisms that she had with respect to the assumption of self-sufficiency and independence, which seem to be contained in the social contract way of thinking about things. This idea that whoever was going to be a participant in the basic social contract should be somebody who's self-sufficient and independent. But oftentimes that's not the case, and it's sort of, if that's the standard, it excludes people. It would exclude people with disabilities. Butler shifts gears a little bit at this point, and she tells the story of a young man. There's a story about a young man who walked with a distinct swish and didn't feel like he should change the way he walked to please other people. But as a result of his mannerisms, that one day he was attacked and killed by a group of young men in a town. I think it's in New England somewhere. And it just raises the question, why would that happen, or what's so offensive about the way somebody walks, and why such a strong reaction, such a violent reaction to being exposed to that? Why so much hatred? Why the violence, towards people who are just different in some way? That's a pretty profound question, and it's easy to think it just applies to other people, but even all of us have our prejudices and our assumptions about what's permitted and what isn't permitted and so forth, and our reactions to people who are different. So this is an instance of what we would call homophobia. And we see that if you challenge the stereotypes or the norms that people have, it makes them feel uncomfortable. In some sense, it makes them question themselves. And it's a complex psychological feature of human beings, I think. But people feel threatened by other people who are different than they are, and oftentimes they act out or they react out. You could say homophobia is a fear or a hatred of homosexuals. So it's like, what is that? What's that all about? And why should it incite sort of violence towards other people? Why is it so intolerable that there might be somebody who is different? But we can see it's very common, and the reactions are frequently very strong and harmful to people. Butler, in an attempt this, a difficult psychological issue, I think, Butler talks about it in terms of vulnerability or permeability. And again, it has to do with this independence and so forth. So if we're trying to understand violence against people who are different, people who are on the fringes or marginalized minorities, etc., you'd say violence can be interpreted as an attempt to assert one's own impenetrability or one's own invulnerability. You act out against other people, and somehow you feel like you're asserting something about yourself, a kind of weakness maybe that you become aware of as a result of your interactions with other people. This issue extends broadly, I think. Arguably, anyone or anything that is different presents a similar challenge to people. We see fear and hatred mixed together. And the truth is, we all have difficulty in accepting differences, but we don't really see what's going on as we have those experiences. Seeing past the differences, or being able to see other people as fellow human beings, that's a kind of an elevated attitude with respect to others that is hard to come by. We still expect everyone else to be like ourselves. It seems to me that we can see this behavior in children, and you say how mean-spirited children can be. I mean, so it's just a mirror, really, for a certain aspect within our own natures. In a way, it's more obvious in children, more blatant, that they act out against differences. But you could say we're not children, and or that when you become a mature adult and so forth, you're supposed to have a better understanding. You could say we should recognize that each of us we're not isolated, independent individuals. You say with the famous line, "No man is an island." All of us we should recognize or come to recognize that whatever life is, we're all in this together somehow, and that we are who we are as a result of our interactions with other people. our inner relationships with others. But we have to work and we have to struggle in order to really be more inclusive and open to differences, open to others. Independence is an ideal, to be worked for, but we have to acknowledge that it's hard to come by. We kind of have to understand what stands in the way of it within ourselves. Notice, sorry, that there's a typo on the previous page. Hopefully you realize the key word is interdependence, and is what we're struggling to achieve, an attitude of interdependence with respect to each other. So we're approaching the end of our semester together, and our study of this particular book, The Examined Life. And here at the end, it seems like a lot of the issues that were spoken about throughout the various interviews that we looked at, it looks like a lot of them begin to converge here at the end. And I'm just going to mention some of them, and whether or not I get them all or not, you'll see. First of all this relationship to differences, finding ways to be more open-minded and fair-handed in our treatment of people who you could say are minorities, or people who are different from mainstream society or cultures, or the majority of people. First of all, racism. You could say, obviously, the struggle for racial equality and equal opportunity for members of all the different races. Cornel West sort of addressed that issue. It seemed in particular the struggle of Black Americans. Feminism. You could say that's a struggle for equal opportunity for women, fair treatment of women, opportunity for women. And that topic was addressed by Martha Nussbaum in hers. You could say in some sense it's also addressed by Judith Butler as a third wave feminist. I think Nussbaum fits the bill a little bit better right here. People with disabilities. In this segment, Sonny Taylor says that people with disabilities are actually the largest minority group of all, and that's the argument of disabilities people, disability rights people, and so forth. So, but the struggle for acceptance of people with disabilities and providing them with equal opportunities for success in life. So this is clearly Sonny Taylor, an issue that she addresses directly. You could say Martha Nussbaum contributes to this discussion as well. LGBT, the struggle for acceptance of their different sexual orientations in a way. Again, the struggle for the acceptance of people who are different than what the norm is perceived to be. Clearly, this is an interest of Judith Butler's. Struggle for ethical treatment of animals. This is seems like a different an animal of a different color. I don't know, whatever how you want to put it, a creature. But care or concern for these creatures that we share our planet with, and very definitely this is a primary interest of Peter Singer's, to bring ethical treatment. Justice sort of should include consideration of animals that we share our planet with. And Sonny Taylor is also interested in this issue, as Nussbaum as well, I think. Ecology, we could say, is another issue where the struggle is to maintain the health of our environment, of the earth. I've put down Slavoj Zizek here. I mean, although I'm not sure that what he says sheds a lot of light on this particular issue, but still it's an issue that we have to be concerned about in the contemporary world in order to ensure sort of better lives for all of us. And finally, you could say social justice, or the struggle to create a society within which all these other minorities can thrive and sort of take their place within the political environment and so forth, so that we could ultimately have justice for all. And you say Nussbaum and Cornel West certainly speak for those issues as well. So all of these kind of come together underneath the broad umbrella of kind of justice or fair treatment of people, and sort of people, all these different groups struggles for their inclusion in the broader society. Finally, to wrap our course up, I want to revisit something we did at the end of the Cornel West presentation, where we listed some of the things that he seemed to include in terms of what it meant to live a philosophical life. Some of those items I would keep as he laid them out, and I think there needs to be some additions, probably, in light of some of the things that we've just been talking about. But I mean, if we think of philosophy as a good thing, which I do, and whether you do or not, I don't know, but if philosophy has to do with some of the things I'm going to include here, I still want to say that philosophy has to address the issues of lived experience. And in a way, to live a philosophical life is to come to terms with how we live our lives, and how we live our lives intelligently, ethically, compassionately, and courageously. In general, we kind of have to adopt within our approach to things a critical disposition. And that just means not taking things at face value, but sort of, trying to dig beneath the surface to see what's really going on. So we want to adopt a critical disposition, as West puts it, wrestling with our desires in the face of death, wrestling with dialogue, keeping dialogues open in the face of dogmatism, and generally struggling to live an examined life, for me especially. So many of the obstacles we have to overcome are obstacles that are buried deep within ourselves. I mean, we see them outside of ourselves in the world, but it all has to begin with kind of self-understanding, self-study, self-understanding, which is arrived at through examining ourselves, as we said, looking into the dark corners of ourselves. So a lot of the problem areas are buried deep within. So our fears, our prejudices, our assumptions about who and what we are and how we should be. All of this needs to be examined, brought into the light of day. Unexamined, all of these things still function in the dark, and because they function in the dark, they keep us in the dark. Examined, I think, is one of the things that West said: when you examine yourself, you can become a different kind of person. And I think that's kind of, it could be an aim for all of us. I mean, to become more enlightened, to become better than what we are. So, thank you for listening.